Thanks. So Simone will stay in the spotlight. Thanks, Indy. Thanks, John. And I'm inviting Glenn Weil from Radical Exchange back to back with Simone on economic democracy and market power. What does it look like to democratize market power itself? So, Glenn?
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
If you can spotlight Glenn, otherwise I will be.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm going to share my screen if that's all right. So my talk will have a fairly different tone than the last one, but hopefully pick up in exactly some of the points that you were highlighting, John and Doshi. So basically, a big point coming out of the last discussion was institutional reform. What is institutional reform that supports regenerative business practices look like? And I want to turn to one of the most powerful tools in the regulatory toolkit, one of the most widely accepted, and think about how we can refashion it to make it an engine for democracy and regeneration. So antitrust, or what in Europe you call competition policy, has its modern origins in a piece of legislation from 1890 called the Sherman Antitrust Act. And in supporting the passage of this act, John Sherman, pictured on the left, who was the brother of the famous Civil War general, William Tecumseh Sherman, said, "If we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of the necessities of life." Now, this sort of rallying cry against the notion of monarchy within the economic realm was met primarily with breakups or prohibitions on mergers, other tools that were meant to limit and constrain or dismember the power of monarchs in different parts of the economy. But I want to argue that this is not the only, or maybe not even the best, response to monarchy and concentrated power. On the left, I've pictured the French Revolution and the way that it addressed the concentrated power of monarchies, which was by dismemberment, quite literally. But an alternative is the Glorious Revolution in England and the progressive process of democratization that occurred there, where rather than breaking up the monarchy or the realm, one instead subjected it to the sovereign will of the people over time. And I want to argue that this approach, the approach of using antitrust as a lever not to limit the size of institutions, but rather to force them to be democratically accountable to those that they hold power over, to democratize them, and to insist on no monopoly power without representation, just like we did no taxation with representation, cuts through many of the false dichotomies in the current antitrust and regulatory discourse. So on the one hand, we want to harness the benefits of economies of scale. Really since the beginning of the modern period, economists have pointed to the power of industrial conglomeration, of cities, of networks, of electrical grids, of all these forms of scale to create tremendous wealth. But at the same time, they've also emphasized the importance of competition. And we've been forced in many cases by antitrust and the current paradigm to choose between these. Another dichotomy is that on the one hand, many Europeans want to see national champions, regional champions that can take on the American or other foreign, leading companies. And they don't want the push for competition and antitrust to get in the way of that. On the other hand, there's a push for global competition, for international cooperation, etc. And again, these are things we've been sort of forced by the current paradigms to choose between. And finally, there's the debate between shareholder value and stakeholder capitalism. And stakeholder capitalism is much more accountable to the people that the company actually has power over, but it's very vague. Who are all these stakeholders? Who else other than the shareholders should be included? And Milton Friedman famously argued that this gave a huge amount of discretion to the managers to just choose to do whatever they want, to be unaccountable to anyone, not just unaccountable to all their shareholders. Can people see my slides, by the way? I saw in the chat that someone's saying they can't see the slides. John, for example, can you see the slides?
Yep.
Okay, people can see the
all
slides.
good.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is lay out this idea of stakeholder antitrust, talk about some of its benefits and limitations, and how it offers a path forward in regulation and antitrust, and then connect it to the broader conversation around regenerative platforms. Okay, so the basic idea of stakeholder antitrust is quite simple. Right now, the paradigm that we have is that a court and a bunch of economists analyze the degree of market power that a firm currently has and the extent to which, say, a merger or some other action could increase that market power. And there's a whole set of tools out there to quantify this. And the usual remedy that's given for this is it's just yes or no. We either break you up or we don't. We either let you merge or we don't. Maybe you could merge some things and not others, but basically the framework is one of slapping down versus supporting, not one of changing the structure to ensure success in the new arrangement. At the same time, there is a big conversation around the world and a big history in Germany, especially, of representing stakeholders directly on the board of directors or otherwise making the firm democratically accountable to the people that it has power over. And my claim is that these each are sort of problems in search of the solution of the other. On the one hand, the stakeholder antitrust and the stakeholder approach is powerful. It's I think a very important way to give influence to people that a company might have power over. But the question is, who does a company have power over? Well, it's a hard thing to measure. It's a hard thing to make a systematic body of law, but that's exactly what antitrust does. Antitrust is all about determining the degree of power that a company has over different stakeholders and could therefore be linked directly. So rather than clearing or prohibiting a merger, you could say, yes, if the people that you gain market power over get a stake in determining the actions of the firm in the future. Yes, you can continue to operate Google or Facebook, but you need to bring your users into a referendum process or a representation process where they have the ability to shape the privacy, the data use, the what the firm is maximizing in its algorithms, et cetera. So I think that this resolves a number of the key tensions in the regulatory space right now. On the one hand, it allows for scale. It allows for these enormous platforms that allow us to connect globally and that make, that are really the substrate for international cooperation, especially in face of less democratic alternatives that have achieved such scale. And at the same time, it avoids those becoming engines of monarchy and oligarchy because as they grow, as they scale, they become more and more democratically accountable to the people they hold power over. They actually become a new site of international democracy. So, I mean, everyone worries the United Nations doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. What if we actually had a factory for creating new international democratic institutions at the same clip that we create international corporations. It gets past the division between there are these global corporations and then there's nation state government by actually, as I said, creating a process through which we're continually creating new international institutions. I think it gets us past the dichotomy between the vagueness of stakeholder capitalism and the and therefore the license that it could give to corporate leaders, and on the other hand, the sort of rapacity of shareholder capitalism by giving us a disciplined, meaningful, administrable way to move beyond and give new stakeholders power. Finally, it helps us, I think, move beyond two different movements to constrain corporate power that are often in tension with each other. Some people advocate for the power of unions or organization. Other people value antitrust, and they think that unions actually concentrate power more. Well, this actually says, no, we can use antitrust as a lever to give power to the people that in a organized way would come together through something like a union. Okay, now, of course, this doesn't deal with all problems. So one issue that it leaves unresolved is that even if a company were to make no profits at all, even if it were to just sustain itself, there are many activities that at scale, if you charge anything at all to sustain them, exclude lots of people. That's the reason why, for example, public transportation often takes a loss, because if you charged everyone enough to pay for the investments that you need to make the public transportation, you'd exclude lots of people who could benefit from using the system. So this isn't going to solve that problem, and that requires other types of approaches, and I'll talk about those later. It also won't address things like environmental externalities. It won't address a lot of the sort of broader social problems that are not captured by direct market power. And it won't address sort of the ways in which there are spillovers to sort of the communities, which are not standard sort of market interactions. So all those important other directions for stakeholder participation just won't be covered by this. They're important, they need to be covered by other things, but focusing on this allows you to very directly answer very particular questions about antitrust and avoiding vagueness in the move towards stakeholder representation. So how would this work in practice? Well, basically, right now, there's a huge number of antitrust cases being brought against large, powerful companies, especially the tech companies. And the Justice Department in the US and the European Commission have discretion to offer lots of different types of remedies. They don't have to just offer you break up or you stay. They can say, well, look, we'll allow this to go forward if you do X. And they could choose to make among those remedies these changes to the structure of how the corporation works, the nature of transparency, who gets to make decisions, etc. Another direction is that with the rise of regulation, antitrust, all the pressure on companies that are in many ways sort of incoherent across countries, making it very hard for companies to operate internationally, the companies themselves could decide, look, we need our own independent source of legitimacy. We need to have the support and the value among publics in all these different countries that makes it very hard politically for those governments to come after us. And to do that, what we're going to do is build a sense among the public that we're actually accountable to them. So this could even be led from the company's side in response to the pressure that's being put on them by different governments. And how could, once you have the pressure to make this happen, the instruments, what would you actually do? Well, I think ideally you'd want to rely on some sort of quantitative metric where the weight that the different stakeholders get in the governance is proportional to the power that the company holds over them. So like I work at Microsoft Corporation, and in many corporations, I'd really like employees to have a vote on the board. But actually at Microsoft, the reality is the people who work for Microsoft are wealthy and powerful generally. This is not a company where the main problem is about the asymmetry of power between the employees and the employer. There's many other elements of the system that there's asymmetries of power between, but not the employees and the employer. So you'd like to say, well, maybe the employees should get a little representation, but the people who really need representation are consumers and the companies that we sell to and so forth. And you'd like that to come out of this type of process. An even more sophisticated approaches allow that to emerge. So there's something called quadratic voting, which is an approach to sort of weighted voting, which allows people to sort of make clear and express what things are most important to them. And there's a lot of really fascinating processes in, yeah, by the way, I want to speak to Rosen's point, which is it's true, not all, there are many Microsoft employees who are not as powerful, but like if you compare it to the global ecosystem, I would say that Microsoft employees are generally part of sort of a tech elite. That's not true of all of them. There's hourly, employees who I do think it's more important to get representation to, but overall, I would say that I don't think Microsoft employees are the main party that's subject to asymmetries of power. And then another really interesting innovative tool is in Taiwan. They've developed a whole bunch of ways of sort of getting people to participate in conversations at scale that drive towards consensus. And in fact, Radical Exchange, the nonprofit that I founded, has a really nice platform that we're developing called Radical Exchange Voice, which combines these different elements, and I think could be a useful foundation for implementing some of this. So I think that the path forward really is through a back and forth dynamic between the pressure that's being put on these companies by people like Lena Khan in the United States, Margareta Vestaya in Europe, mostly pressuring for change. And then the sort of reaction from people who are more in the establishment, people who are connected to the business community like Colin Meyer, and people like Jean Tirole, who are very mainstream antitrust leaders, saying, okay, we hear the pressure, and here's how we're going to incorporate it into the existing institution. Most democratization, I think, happens in exactly that way. And finally, I think that this connects to the broader conversation about regenerative finance, regenerative platforms, because ultimately, there's a lot of really great experiments that are going on. There's a lot of really good thinking about how entrepreneurship can be more regenerative, exit to community, great new funding approaches from Gitcoin for open source software, et cetera. But these have to be accompanied by a change to the largest companies in the world that restrains their ability to sort of crush that opportunity, and that offers a pathway for current regenerative platforms that are emerging to, as they head towards scale, find pressures and support for maintaining that community control. And I think that that's exactly what this type of new approach to antitrust can do. So thanks so much, and love any interaction I can have with the group.